Good morning, students. Today we will read about the different sectors of the Indian economy. Let me ask you a question. What do you understand by sectors of the Indian economy? What is an economy? An economy is defined by a way wherein the country's resources are utilized to produce goods and services in such a manner that these goods and services are distributed for consumption. It is a system that involves production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services between the entities in a particular society. And we can understand best of economy when we study its components or sectors. In this chapter, sectoral classification is done on the basis of various criteria: primary sector, secondary sector, tertiary sector, or organized and unorganized sector, public and private sector. So in this chapter, the important concepts which we will cover are the following. First, three important sectors of economy. Second, historical change in economy. Third, rising importance of tertiary sector. Fourth, organized and unorganized sectors. Fifth, public and private sector. So children, now let's discuss the different sectors of the Indian economy. Economic activities are divided into three categories called the sectors of the Indian economy. And we divided these sectors into three just to know how much production and how many resources are being utilized by a particular type of activity or a particular sector. The different sectors of the Indian economy are primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector. So children, here we divided the three different sectors of the Indian economy in the form of a flowchart: primary sector, secondary sector, tertiary sector. Here children, we discuss one of the most important sectors of the Indian economy, that is the primary sector. Primary sector is mainly dependent on agricultural activities or activities related to the natural resources. It depends mostly upon natural factors like rainfall, sunshine, and climate. When we talk about primary sector, the end product is always a natural product in a raw form. Example, cotton. There are many other activities in the primary sector except the agricultural activities like dairy farming, fishing, forestry. So, due to this, it is also called agriculture and related sector. Children, here you can see the different activities undertaken in the primary sector of the Indian economy. You can see farmers growing crops, cows grazing in field, banana plantation, flower gardens, also known as horticulture. There's a concept map of the primary sector where you can see the different activities undertaken in this sector: mining, coal, iron, etc. Agriculture, that is growing crops, or through livestock, that means through animals like dairy farming, etc. Fishing, forestry, or oil extraction. These are all the activities of the primary sector, the first and the most important sector of the Indian economy. Children, now we move on to the second sector of the Indian economy, which is also known as the secondary sector. It covers activities in which natural products are changed into other forms through ways of manufacturing that we associate with industrial activities. Example: using cotton fiber from plants, we spin yarn and weave cloth, etc. This sector gradually became associated with the different kinds of industries that came up, and it is also known as the industrial sector of the Indian economy. And children, here you can see how the secondary sector or the industrial sector looks like. Moving on, children, to the other important sector of the Indian economy, that is the tertiary sector. This is the sector which helps in the development of the other two sectors, that is the primary sector and the secondary sector. This sector does not produce a good, but it is an aid or a support for the production process. For example, transportation of goods to various places for retail and wholesale markets. Once the goods are ready in the industrial sector or the manufacturing sector, they are to be transported. So that transportation, that service providing sector, is known as tertiary sector. Few other examples of the tertiary sector or the service providing sector are transportation, storage, communication, banking, trade, etc. And here we have the glimpse to the tertiary sector, the service sector of the Indian economy. These services are non-physical products that cannot be touched or stored, like a haircut or a train journey. Examples: transport, advertising, retail, teaching, healthcare, hotels, etc. After understanding the three different sectors of the Indian economy, primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector, now let's compare all these three sectors, how they contribute to the Indian economy. It is very important to count various goods and services and know the total production of each sector. And children, remember, only the cost of final goods and services are counted, neglecting the raw products. This is because the cost of intermediate goods, that means the goods which are used in between to make a final good, they get converted to final products, are already included in the overall cost. The value of final goods and services produced in each sector during a particular year provides the total production of the sector that year. The sum of production of all three sectors, primary, secondary and tertiary sector, it gives us the gross domestic product, GDP of the country. GDP shows how big the economy is. So the contribution of each sector is very important in making the Indian economy a strong economy. Children, now we will discuss how different changes have come up in the three different sectors of the economy. Initially, when the development started, primary sector was the most important sector of any economy. If we look into histories of many now developed countries, that at initial stages of their development, primary sector was the most important sector of economic activity. With the time, as the methods of farming changed and agriculture sector began to prosper, it produced much more food than before. Many people could now take up other activities. There were increasing number of craft persons and traders. Buying and selling activities increased many times. And after that, new methods of manufacturing and factories started expanding. So the shift transferred to the secondary sector or manufacturing sector. Those people who had earlier worked in farms now began to work in factories in large numbers. People began to use many more goods that were produced in factories at cheap rates. Secondary sector gradually became the most important in total production and employment. Hence, over time, a shift had taken place. This means that the importance of the sectors had changed. And in the past 100 years, there has been a further shift from secondary to tertiary sector in developed countries. The service sector has become the most important in terms of total production. More of the working people are also employed in the service sector. They started moving from agricultural sector to secondary sector and now to the tertiary sector. Tertiary sector has become one of the most important sectors of economy these days. As we just discussed, children, that there is rising importance of the tertiary sector. Nowadays, most of the countries focus on developing their tertiary sector. It has emerged as the largest producing sector in India. There are a number of reasons that the tertiary sector is becoming so important these days. Like in any country, several services such as hospitals, educational institutions, post and telegraph services, police stations, courts, etc. are required. and these can be considered as basic services in a developing country. And the government has to take responsibility for the provision of these services. Second, the development of agriculture and industry leads to the development of services such as transport, trade, storage, etc. The greater the development of the primary and secondary sectors, more would be the demand for such services for the tertiary sector. Third, as the income levels rise, certain sections of people start demanding many more services like eating out, tourism, shopping, private hospitals, private schools, professional training courses, etc. So when you start demanding these kind of services, it ultimately increases the importance of tertiary sector. Fourth, over the past decades, so many certain new services such as information and communication technology have become important and essential. And due to these, nowadays, tertiary sector has got importance comparing to the other two sectors. So children, we discussed about the three different sectors of the economy: primary sector, secondary sector and tertiary sector. Now let's see, where are most people employed in which sector? There are two graphs. Graph 2, which is showing us the share of sectors in GDP percentage. Graph 3, shares of sectors in employments percentage. And the two financial years have been taken up for the comparison: 1973 to 74, 2013 to 14. Blue color reflects the primary sector, pink color reflects the secondary sector, and the green color reflects the tertiary sector. Now let's read graph 2 first, which shows us the share or the contribution of different sectors in GDP. When you look at 1973 and 74, you can see 40% contribution of primary sector and 10% contribution of secondary sector, and the remaining 50% is the contribution of tertiary sector. When you compare it with 2013 and 14, you see just 10% is contributed by the primary sector, then another 20% is shared by the secondary sector, and the remaining from 30 to 100, that is 70%, is shared by the tertiary sector. So the contribution from the tertiary sector to the GDP is more these days, is increasing. The contribution of tertiary sector is increasing in the GDP. On the other hand, in which sectors more people are employed? Let's see in graph 3, 1972-73 data and 2011 and 12 data. 1972 to 73 shows 74% people employed in primary sector, 11% people employed in secondary sector, and 15% people were employed in tertiary sector. Then we compare it with 2011 and 12. The most number of people are still employed in primary sector, that is 49%. Secondary sector is 24% and tertiary sector has 27%. When we talk about the share in GDP, It is more from the tertiary sector, but the employment there is just 27%. And you talk about the primary sector's contribution in GDP, it's hardly 10%. And when you see people employed is 49%. So that means we need to increase employment opportunities in the tertiary sector rather than people being disguised unemployed in primary sector. So you have already seen through the different graphs that where the most people are employed. Let's see here also. We talked about the primary sector as the most absorbing sector in the terms of employment. More than half of the population of India is working in primary sector, but its contribution to the GDP is very less. Therefore, the primary sector has more people than necessary. Hence, they are called underemployed. They are not using their full potential to contribute it to the GDP of the nation. Such an hidden underemployment is known as disguised unemployment, where people are actually employed, but their contribution to the GDP is zero. Such type of underemployment can also be seen in other sectors like painters, plumbers, etc., who do not get work every day. But by reading the graphs, we get to know that primary sector is a sector where most people are employed, but its contribution to the GDP is very less comparing to the other two sectors, that is secondary sector and tertiary sector. And to solve the unemployment situations in our country, to develop more employment opportunities, what steps can be taken? So children, let's read. How can more employment be generated? First and the most important duty to create employment opportunities is ultimately be of the Government of India. Government can help by investing some money in transportation and trade. Local banks can give credits to farmers at lower rate of interest. Tourism industry in the country can also be expanded to create more number of jobs in tourism sector. Regional craft industry or new services like IT can be generated so that the disguised unemployment from the primary sector can be reduced and the potential of people can be used in other sectors. And different schemes are started by the government to provide employment to people in India. And one step out of this all is the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act 2005, which is also known as NREGA 2005. Under this, all those who are able to and are in need of work are given 100 days of guaranteed employment in a year, failing which the government will have to give unemployment allowances. So it gives a security for 100 days of work to people who are willing to work, who are in need of work. And if government is not able to provide them more, then the unemployment allowances are given by the government. So children, we had discussed the sectors on the basis of various production activities in the primary, secondary and tertiary sectors. where a large number of goods and services are produced. Now we shall get to the other way of classifying activities in the economy. This looks at the way people are employed. What are their conditions of work? Are there any rules and regulations that are followed as regards for their employment? So now we will study the division of sectors as organized and unorganized sector. Organized sector is the sector which covers those places of work where employment is regular and work is assured and secured. They are registered by the government and have to follow its rules and regulations under laws such as Minimum Wages Act, etc. It is called organized because it has formal processes and procedures. People who are employed in organized sectors, they get paid leaves, provident funds, medical benefits, safe working environment, and pensions after they retire. If they work more than the stipulated time, they are paid more for the overtime they had done in the work. So these are all the features of organized sector, where the work is done in an organized way, in a formal processes and procedures. Children, now let's see the other way people are employed, the unorganized sector. In this sector, there are small units or places of work where employment is not regular and not in government control. The firms are not registered with the government but have their own rules and regulations under different conditions. And the employees who are working there are less paid and not have regular job. We call it an unorganized sector because they do not follow any formal procedure. They are pursued by people or the owners with their own whims, their own conditions created for the work. They provide no paid leave, provident fund, medical benefit, safe working environment, and pensions after they retire. This is the reason the employees working in an unorganized sector, they are insecure. Even if they work more than the stipulated time, they are not paid more for the overtime they had done. As employees, they do not enjoy job security in an unorganized sector. So this is how we divided the two sectors as organized sector and unorganized sector by the way people working in different conditions. So another way of classifying economic activities into sectors could be on the basis of who owns assets and is responsible for the delivery of services. So on the basis of ownership, we divided the sectors into two, the public and private sectors. First, we will read about the public sector. Here, the government owns all the assets and is responsible for delivery of services. For example, the Indian Railways or the post offices. And the main motive of the public sector is not just to earn profit, it is to provide services to people at minimum cost. Because the other way of raising money for the government is through taxes and other ways. Because there are several things needed by the society as a whole, but which the private sector will not provide at a reasonable cost. Some of these need spending large sums of money, which is beyond the capacity of the private sector. So collecting money from thousands of people who use these facilities is not easy. Example: construction of railways, bridges, harbors, providing irrigation through dams, etc. Governments have to undertake such heavy spending and ensure that these facilities are available for everyone. So these types of activities and services are owned by the government, or they come under the public sector. At times, the government also has to support the private sector to make facilities economic to the local people. They provide some subsidies to the private sector so that the services available does not cost much to the people, providing health facilities and education facilities. They are supported by the government also. Children, the other way of ownership in the sectors is private ownership, or we can say the private sector. Under this, the individuals or companies own all the assets and are responsible for delivery of services. For example, Tata Iron and Steel, Reliance Industries, etc. The purpose of this sector is to earn more and more profit. People have to pay more money to get facilities from such companies who are owned by private individuals. Mostly the cost of the service rendered by them is not reasonable. And at times, governments have to support these private sector industries so that their cost of production of goods may not push much. Government has to bear a certain part of the cost so that their products do not cost much to people. So this is how we divide the two sectors on the basis of ownership: the public sector and the private sector. One is the public sector, which is owned by the government, and the other is the private sector, owned by the individuals or private companies. Children, summing up now what we read in the chapter, we looked at different ways of classifying economic activities into some meaningful groups. One way of doing this was to examine whether the activity related to the primary, secondary, or tertiary sector. The another classification was to consider whether people are working in organized or unorganized sectors. Most people are working in the unorganized sectors, and the protection is necessary for them. We also looked at the different ways of owning assets and services. that is the difference between private and public activities. And why is it important for public activities to focus on certain areas? I hope the topics we covered are clear to you all. This is all for today's lecture. I hope you all understood it. Now I take leave of you all. Thank you.